Have you ever looked into someone's eyes and seen not a person, but a ghost? A flicker of something so ancient, so wounded, that it chills you to the bone. We use words like crazy or unstable to label that flicker. We turn away. But the truth is far more profound and far more human. The path to what we call madness isn't a sudden detour. It's a long, slow exodus from the self. It begins not with a scream, but with a whisper, the whisper of a child who learned very early that their reality didn't matter. Eli was that child. He wasn't born broken. He was born with wonder in his eyes, dreaming in colors, asking why 1,000 times a day. But the house he grew up in was built on fault lines. His father's footsteps on the porch at night weren't a homecoming, they were a warning siren. His mother's silence wasn't peace, it was a retreat into a private fortress. Eli learned the geography of survival before he learned multiplication. He mapped the creaks in the floorboards like landmines. The dinner table was a silent war zone where words, when they came, were weapons, and no one ever said sorry. The apology never arrived. But the trauma itself wasn't the deepest wound. The deepest wound was the denial. The forced, brittle smiles in public. The family portrait of normalcy hung over a crater. The way everyone pretended the screaming last night didn't happen. This is where the poison seeps in, when your reality is gaslit by the very people who are supposed to validate it. You learn a terrible lesson. Your feelings are lies. Your pain is an inconvenience. Your truth is a problem to be buried. A human mind is resilient, but it's not a fortress. Trauma doesn't just live in memory. It takes root in the body.
It becomes a constant low-grade alarm in your nervous system. It rewires your core beliefs before you even have the words for them. For Eli, it taught him this: you are not safe. You are not worthy of protection. Your existence is conditional. So he built a new self, a charming, funny, shape-shifting self that could read a room in seconds and become exactly what it needed. He became a master performer. And on the outside, it worked. He was likable, even admired. But inside, he was hollow, a room abandoned after a fire. The walls of his personality still stood, but the soul of the place was gone, leaving only the scent of smoke and ash. That hollowness is the signature of unprocessed pain. It splits you. You become the performer and the audience and the critic in the dark, and none of them know each other. The psychiatrist Carl Jung said, "The greatest tragedy of the family is the unlived lives of the parents."
Eli didn't just inherit his parents' eyes or their smile. He inherited their unlived lives, their rage, their silence, their unmet longings. He inherited a legacy of emotional neglect, carried not in genes, but in the cold space between words. He didn't go crazy in a flash. It was a slow unraveling, a thread pulled over years. It started with a feeling he couldn't name, a constant humming sense that something was profoundly wrong, even on the sunniest, most successful days. Then came the insomnia, nights spent staring at the ceiling, his mind a dark cinema playing scenes he thought he'd forgotten. Paranoia crept in. He'd read malice in a coworker's glance, hear contempt in a friend's casual joke. Rage would bubble up, sudden and volcanic, often aimed at himself. A corrosive self-hatred set in. He couldn't trust anyone because he'd learned the closest people were the most dangerous. And he certainly couldn't trust himself, the part of him that felt like a raw, exposed nerve. Relationships became impossible landscapes. He'd ache for connection, pull someone close, and then, terrified of the vulnerability, he'd become the saboteur. He'd pick fights, create distance, push them away with both hands. Then, consumed by loneliness, he'd beg them to return. Love wasn't a sanctuary. It was a battlefield, where he was both the frightened soldier and the one planting the mines. He tried therapy once, sat in a quiet office and told a professional in a flat voice that he couldn't feel anything anymore. that his dreams were chaotic, violent puzzles, that sometimes he'd look in the mirror and the face looking back was a stranger's. They gave him labels: anxiety, depression. But those words were like trying to describe a forest fire by talking about the temperature of the smoke. They couldn't touch the real monster, the centuries-old pain buried beneath the labeled symptoms, the pain he had never, ever learned how to speak. Because when trauma is ignored, it doesn't vanish. It goes underground. It ferments. It waits in the shadows of your unconscious, and it always, always comes out. Not in a polite memo, but in a takeover. For Eli, it began to speak through him. He started talking to himself. Not idle muttering, but full, impassioned conversations, arguments with phantom figures from his past. He'd walk past mirrors without a glance, as if acknowledging his own reflection was too intimate a betrayal. He carried a notebook, scribbling down thoughts that were cryptic, symbolic, a private language of anguish that made no sense to anyone else. Old friends would say, "He changed." But that wasn't quite right.
The truth was, he had always been this way. He had just finally, completely, run out of the energy required to hide it. That's the brutal secret no one tells you about crossing that invisible line. It's not about madness, it's about exhaustion. It's the soul's white flag, the psyche giving up the performance because the cost of maintenance has become fatal. When you spend a lifetime suppressing your wounds, your fears, the raw truth of your experience, the mind eventually fractures. It wasn't designed to be two people at once. The human psyche is a fragile tapestry, woven from memory, emotion, belief, and meaning. And when too much of that fabric is soaked in pain and sealed in silence, the threads begin to snap, one by one. Eli began to believe the voices. He started seeing symbols everywhere, in the pattern of rain on a window, the number on a license plate, the flicker of a streetlight. He called them patterns, clues. He became convinced the universe was speaking to him directly, literally, in a code only he could decipher. What was really happening? His mind, starved for the order and validation it never received, was now desperately creating meaning from the chaos. It was trying to solve the unsolvable puzzle of his past. This is the cruel, ingenious trick of unresolved trauma.
It won't let you rest. It disguises itself as mystical insight, as paranoid vigilance, as creative genius. But at its core, it's always the same. A child, frozen in time, screaming into a void, "Please, see me, hear me, save me." But by the time the scream becomes this loud, the world has stopped listening. Society doesn't understand this kind of rupture. It fears it. It medicalizes it, criminalizes it, turns it into a spectacle. Eli risked becoming just another cautionary tale, a statistic, a what went wrong. But here is the essential truth. He didn't break because he was weak. He broke because he was forced to be strong for too long, holding up a reality that was never true. Some would call it psychosis, but Carl Jung offered another perspective: individuation, the difficult, often terrifying process of becoming whole by facing the darkest, most chaotic parts of the self you've disowned. For Eli, it didn't feel noble or spiritual. It felt like drowning, like being pulled into a riptide of something ancient and screaming. It spoke in fragments, in symbols, in the echoes of slamming doors and the taste of forgotten tears.
You don't just lose your mind one day. It's a slow crack in a mirror, spiderwebbing over decades. Outsiders see the final shatter and say, "He snapped." They didn't see the millions of tiny fractures that came before. The silent nights, the swallowed words, the loneliness in a crowded room. When you bury the past, you don't kill it, you make it a ghost. And ghosts don't die, they haunt.
Eli wasn't haunted by memories. He was haunted by the emotional weight of years of abandonment, of shame, of grief that was never allowed to be grief. This is where the line blurs. In psychology, we talk about the false self, the persona crafted purely for survival. It's a mask that smiles, conforms, says the right thing. It buries the true self so deep you forget it exists. But the true self doesn't forget you. One day, the mask cracks. It can't hold the weight anymore. And when it shatters, what's left is the shadow. The grief you said didn't matter. The rage you claimed wasn't yours. The voice that whispers, you were never loved the way you needed to be. This is what going crazy really is. It's not an illness. It's the soul's last-ditch protest, the scream of a psyche silenced for too long.
And in its own devastating way, it is also a chance. Because when everything collapses, the lies, the persona, the carefully constructed world, you are left, naked and trembling, with the one thing that can save you, the truth. Eli's truth was brutal. He was abused. He was neglected. His pain was real and it mattered. For years he told himself it didn't, but it did. It always did. He began to write again, not for clarity or healing, but simply to excavate. The pages were chaos, scribbles, dark drawings, the same sentence scratched 50 times. I didn't deserve this. That sentence didn't bring peace. It brought permission. Permission to finally feel the anger, the sadness, the colossal unfairness of it all. And in that storm of feeling, he found something he hadn't touched since childhood, a fragile, defiant seed of hope. He returned to therapy, but this time he didn't perform. He didn't try to be the good patient. He wept. He wept for the boy who learned to tiptoe. He wept for the man who never felt safe. He wept for the madness that once he stopped running, began to make a terrible kind of sense. He wasn't cured. He would never be the person he was before the crack.
But he was no longer lost. He learned that the madness was never the enemy. It was a message. A desperate, coded message from the parts of himself he'd locked in the basement. And when he finally turned the key and opened the door, those parts didn't attack him. They thanked him. Because after a lifetime, someone was finally listening. If you've ever felt the ground growing soft beneath you, if the world feels too loud and your own mind feels like a foreign country, know this: you are not broken. You are buried. And healing is not about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before the world taught you to forget. It begins not with motivation, but with honesty. And honesty is often found in the deepest pain. Start by listening, not to the noise of the world, but to the sacred, silent cry within. Write without judgment. Speak without shame. Read the stories that map the inner world. Not just symptom lists, but explorations of the soul that trace the lineage of pain back to its source in forgotten rooms and unspoken family rules. Because the world doesn't need more perfect masks. It needs more people who have faced their shadow, survived the drowning, and returned to tell the tale, not as victims, but as witnesses to the incredible, painful, human journey of becoming real. Remember, the most profound healing often begins not in the light, but in the courageous, tender act of befriending your own darkness and listening to what it has always been trying to say.